So, good morning. My talk this morning is called Working with Blame. And those of you that have been coming here a while know that I like to take sort of common human behaviors and responses and sort of look at them through a Buddhist lens. And we're going to do that again this morning. Several weeks ago, when we talked about everything being our teacher, that talk, there was some discussion. A couple folks raised the issue of blaming as an interpersonal challenge in terms of dealing with other folks. So this morning, I want to talk a little bit about the sources of blame in our relationships, as well as some ideas, again, from a Buddhist Dharma perspective, about how to manage this tendency to blame. I heard someone say recently that if there was no blame, there would be no need for forgiveness. That sort of struck me, that quote from a fellow psychologist. But anyway, I don't need to tell you that blaming is a pervasive tendency in human interactions. It's defined as a emotionally charged reaction that seeks to assign fault to others and sometimes to ourselves. And from a Buddhist perspective, the act of blaming probably arises from patterns, pretty deep-seated patterns, somewhere within the three poisons of greed, hatred, and delusion that lie at the heart of most of our suffering. So I'll try to lay that out in more detail in a few minutes. But fortunately, the Buddhist path offers some profound teachings and practical methods to understand and manage and ultimately transcend, or at least lessen, the cycle of blaming, which would, of course, lead to greater harmony with oneself and others. So in examining the causes of blaming through a Buddhist lens, we highlight the role of what he called the mental defilements and the deluded sense of a fixed self. At its core, blaming, we could say that blaming stems from a fundamental misperception of reality, which is rooted in the poison of ignorance. This ignorance that creates this false I, this false mind, this tendency to protect and defend this illusory self, what we always talk about here, the ego, our old friend, the ego. And when circumstances challenge our expectations, our fixed, our clinging to certain expectations, or our sense of control, we tend to become reactive. The mind reacts with aversion, seeking an external source to project that responsibility on, to hold accountable for our own discomfort or dissatisfaction. What I'm saying is that the ego doesn't want to own our dissatisfaction. We want to find a way to push it out and project it outwardly. We want to offload the responsibility for our own missteps or our own suffering. And that really is I think, the essence of blame. In the world, according to the Dharma, everything arises due to a complex network of causes and conditions. Things just aren't singularly created. No single factor can be isolated as the sole source of any single event. Life is just not that simple. When we blame, we simplify this intricate web of causes and conditions. We assign fault to a specific individual or specific circumstances. It's just way too simplistic. We can conveniently reduce the issue to simple cause and effect. You did this, so I'm going to blame you for that. This act of simplification reflects really a lack of understanding of the interdependence of all of us and all things and all phenomenon. Blame often arises from the poison of aversion, that we talk about frequently, greed, hatred, and delusion, or aversion being often translated as a hatred or aversion, that poison. When confronted with pain, frustration, loss, our minds instinctively seek an outlet for the discomfort. We want to find an explanation for it. And that's what I meant a moment ago when I said the ego wants to offload the discomfort. The ego wants to offload the suffering. And this aversion manifests usually as anger, irritation, annoyance, which we then project outwardly toward others, or, as I said, sometimes inwardly toward ourselves. Anger and blame may be temporarily satisfying, but they only deepen our suffering. They only perpetuate negative interpersonal patterns. They get in the way of our relationships. When did blame ever make a relationship better? As we often note here, I think this is a quote from Wes often, do you want to be right or do you want to be happy? And I think that applies to blame. And as I've said, the ego plays a central role in the act of blaming. Again, from the Buddhist teaching, the ego is a construct of the mind that's always seeking validation and protection. When the ego feels threatened by criticism, by failure, by perceived injustice, it reacts defensively, often blaming others to preserve our own sense of righteousness, our own sense of superiority, our own sense of the moral high ground. And this attachment to the false self, this fixed self, again, the ego, reinforces this illusion of separateness and hinders our path to freedom. Our practice shows us every day, if we're paying attention, to the efforts of the ego to make sure everything is about me, 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 and that I'm protecting it, preserving it, and making it look good. Now, another source of blaming is as a conditioned response, just reinforced by past experience and societal norms. Culturally, blame is often accepted or encouraged behavior because it's used to assert dominance, to avoid responsibility, and to maintain control over others. If I blame you and I demonize you and I other you, then I can perhaps have control over you, or at least rally the troops to push against you. And we constantly see this, sadly, in our modern politics, probably in politics for as long as they've existed. But over time, this cultural conditioning becomes ingrained, making blame an automatic reaction to any adversity. So with that background, with that sort of context, let's look at managing blame more skillfully, because it's not going away. The good news is that the Dharma offers a wealth of tools and practices to manage and ultimately lessen our tendency to blame. And these are, not surprisingly, rooted in mindful awareness, ethical conduct, and wisdom, important teachings that we talk about here often. And those tools help us transform the mind and cultivate a more compassionate and skillful approach to the challenge of blame. The first step here in managing blame is to cultivate the practice of present moment awareness so we can notice when the urge to blame arises. There's our noticing. We're mindful, oh, here comes, I want to blame you. I can feel it arise. I don't just shoot from the hip. I pay attention and watch when it's arising. And it's interesting how frequently that happens when we begin to tune into it. And through mindfulness, we observe the arising of it without reacting impulsively. We build in the pause, that critical sacred pause. When blame arises, we pause and ask ourselves, what is the root of this reaction? Is it fear? Is it anger? Is it a desire to protect my ego? Something's going on here. And typically the ego is always in the mix. By bringing awareness to the underlying feelings and emotions and the underlying need to protect the ego, we create some space to respond more consciously and deliberately rather than just reactively, which is true with so many of the things we talk about here, none the least of which is blame. Next, we reflect on the interconnected nature of existence so that we see that, going back to causes and conditions, that no single person or factor is entirely responsible for any outcome. Stuff happens for complex reasons. Stuff happens randomly. It's not just A equals B. And this is contrary to our illusion, our efforts to control and have things be predictable. And the beauty of that insight is that it fosters a certain humility. It's like, hey, this stuff is bigger than me. I can't just reduce it to simple formulas. It fosters compassion, which can help reduce the impulse to assign blame. For instance, if a colleague makes a mistake, rather than blaming them, could we consider a broader context? Were they under stress? Did they lack proper training? What else might be going on? We step away. We create spaciousness as is found in the biblical teaching. Let he who is without sin throw the first stone. In other words, let he who is without blame throw the first stone. I love that teaching because it really reflects what we're talking about today. This is bigger than just simple cause and effect. It helps us to see that none of us are totally blameless. So that's when we bring into the picture the practice of loving kindness. It's a powerful antidote to blame, because by cultivating goodwill toward all beings, including ourselves, we transform the energy of anger and aversion into compassion and understanding. I just read an article yesterday about the power of loving kindness. We really underestimate what seems like a simple practice in terms of its power, its transformative power. It helps us recognize the shared vulnerability of all of us, of all beings. And through that, we're less likely to blame and more likely to respond with kindness and understanding. Instead of blaming someone for their shortcomings, we might empathize with their struggles, because we have our own struggles. We see that in a more spacious, inclusive way. And none of what I have been speaking about is possible without loosening our attachment to the ego, managing it skillfully. We recognize this reflexive tendency of the ego to want to win, to want to have the last word, to want to be the top dog, to want to look good to the world. And blaming others for our mistakes helps accomplish all of that. That's what motivates it. It's a protective kind of default. Another powerful practice is forgiveness and managing blame, both toward ourselves and others. From a Buddhist perspective, forgiveness does not mean condoning harmful actions, but it says we release the mental burden of our own anger and resentment. By forgiving others, we free ourselves from the chains of blame and create conditions for healing and reconciliation. Similarly, self-forgiveness is essential for overcoming the tendency to blame ourselves and for fostering self-compassion. And then finally, right speech and right intention, this is the ethical piece, encourages us to communicate truthfully and kindly, avoiding harsh and accusatory language, of which blame is a part of that. Right intention reminds us to cultivate intentions rooted in non-harming, goodwill, and renunciation. So by aligning our words and intentions with these ethical principles, we navigate conflicts more skillfully and we reduce the cycle of blame. Blaming is a deeply ingrained habit of the mind that arises from greed, hatred, and delusion. But it perpetuates suffering by reinforcing the illusion of separateness and obstructing the path to understanding, compassion, and reconciliation. But through the wisdom of the Buddhist teachings and our practices such as mindfulness, reflecting on interdependence, loving kindness, and forgiveness, we transform the impulse to blame into an opportunity for growth and connection. By letting go of blame, we not only free ourselves from unnecessary suffering, we contribute to a more harmonious community, a more compassionate community. In the words of the Buddha from the Dhammapada, he says, hatred does not cease by hatred, but only by love. This is the eternal rule. Hatred does not cease by hatred, but only by love. This is the eternal rule. So we need to think about letting this timeless wisdom guide us and transcending the cycle of blame and cultivating a peaceful heart. So that is working with blame.